Midnight over Tokyo. The city slept beneath a thin winter haze, unaware that the sky above was already filling with the distant rumble of engines, hundreds of them. At first it was a low vibration like thunder rolling from a storm far away, but this was no storm of nature. It was the sound of 279 American B-29 Superfortresses, each one a flying giant, each one carrying a deadly cargo, designed not to shatter buildings but to burn an entire city to ash. Suddenly the darkness broke. Bomb bay doors yawned open and clusters of M69 incendiary bomblets rained down in glittering arcs. Within seconds, the wooden houses of Tokyo's crowded Shitamachi district ignited. Flames leapt from roof to roof, merging into roaring walls of fire. What had begun as sparks instantly became a firestorm, an inferno so intense that oxygen itself seemed to vanish from the streets below. From the cockpits of the superfortresses, American crews gasped as towers of heat and flame shot upward, battering their aircraft. They had never imagined such a sight, a metropolis transforming into a furnace the night sky, glowing red the very air, alive with turbulence and the smell of burning fuel. Below, Tokyo's citizens ran in panic. Families clutched children and possessions only to find escape routes swallowed by rivers of fire. Bridges collapsed, canals boiled, and the scream of the wind mixed with the crackle of napalm. It was a night when time itself seemed to halt, when every second decided between life and death. This was not just another air raid. It was the single deadliest bombing in human history, a night when American air power proved unstoppable, and an empire's heartland was consumed in flame. In early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its most desperate phase. Japan still refused to surrender even as American forces advanced ever closer island by island toward the home islands. The capture of the Marianas in the summer of 1944 had finally placed the Japanese heartland within range of the B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced heavy bomber of its age. Yet the campaign that followed was not the swift, decisive blow the US had envisioned. At first, American commanders tried to use the B-29 seconds in the same way the 8th Air Force had operated over Germany, high-altitude precision raids against industrial plants and military targets. But Japan was not Germany. The jet stream, a powerful band of winds discovered by the crews themselves, screamed over Japan at speeds of 100 to 200 miles per hour, scattering formations and tossing bombs far from their intended targets. Precision at 3,000 feet became impossible. Entire missions ended with bombs drifting harmlessly into the sea or onto empty fields. General Curtis LeMay, the hard-driving new commander of the XXI Bomber Command, recognized that the entire strategy had to change. LeMay was ruthless, unflinching, and supremely practical. To him, victory meant adaptation. If high-altitude precision failed, then the bombers would go low. If conventional explosives could not cripple Japanese production, then fire would. He stripped the B-29 seconds of most of their defensive guns to make room for more incendiary bombs. Crews were horrified at the idea of flying into the heart of Japan at night, at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, essentially naked against fighters and flak. But LeMay was confident. Japanese air defenses were crumbling, their pilots poorly trained, their fuel stocks nearly gone. The gamble was his to take. The weapon chosen was terrifyingly simple. The M69 incendiary bomblet was a small cylinder filled with napalm gel and fitted with a time fuse. Packed by the dozens into clusters known as E46 seconds, each B-29 could release hundreds of these canisters which ignited upon impact and splattered flaming gel across wooden houses. Tokyo was uniquely vulnerable. The eastern districts, known as the Shitamachi, were a maze of narrow streets lined with wooden homes, paper walls, and small backyard workshops. These humble dwellings were not just residences but part of Japan's wartime economy, tens of thousands of cottage industries producing tools, uniforms, and components for the military. Burning the neighborhoods meant destroying the industrial base hidden within them. The Japanese knew they were vulnerable, but they had little defense. Their cities were among the most combustible in the world, and by 1945 firefighting services were overwhelmed and under-equipped. Water pressure was weak, hydrants scarce, and fire breaks minimal. The army had placed anti-aircraft guns around Tokyo nearly 600 inches number, but few could reach effectively at night. Radar coverage was limited, and fighter aircraft often scrambled too late with too little fuel to sustain long engagements. The grim reality was that Japan was nearly defenseless against the storm that was coming. LeMay tested his new approach in late February 1945. A raid against Tokyo on the 25th, though smaller, proved the concept. Incendiaries set fires that spread rapidly through the dense districts, causing damage far out of proportion to the tonnage dropped. The lesson was clear: if hundreds of B-29 seconds attacked simultaneously, the effect would be cataclysmic. Thus, Operation Meetinghouse was planned. The date was set for the night of March 9–10, 1945. Nearly 300 bombers would take off from Guam, Saipan and Tinian, each loaded to the maximum with incendiaries. Their orders to sweep across Tokyo in waves, dropping fire in carefully plotted patterns to create overlapping zones of destruction. The aim was not to hit a single factory, but to ignite an entire district, to overwhelm firefighting capacity instantly, and to generate a firestorm, an inferno so vast that it would consume oxygen, suck in winds, and multiply itself until no human effort could contain it. For the Americans, it was both a military calculation and a psychological one. They believed that burning the enemy's capital, the very seat of imperial power, would shatter morale and force the Japanese leadership to confront the inevitability of defeat. For the Japanese civilians who lived in the Shitamachi, it was unimaginable. They had endured raids before, but nothing like what was coming. Families had dug air raid shelters, stockpiled water buckets, and practiced evacuation drills. Yet no drill could prepare them for the scale of destruction that hundreds of B-29 seconds each, carrying tons of fire, could unleash in a single night. By the afternoon of March 9th, the great airfields of the Marianas buzzed with activity. Ground crews loaded bomb bays with clusters of M-69s checked engines and fueled the giant bombers. Pilots and navigators gathered for briefings where they were shown maps marked with grids and drop zones. The plan was simple yet merciless. Begin with pathfinders who would use radar to lay down strips of incendiaries, then have the following formations fill in the target area until the Shitamachi became a sheet of flame. In Tokyo, as night fell, life went on almost normally. Families ate their evening meals, children studied by dim lamps, shopkeepers closed their shutters. The city had endured hardship, but many still clung to the illusion that Japan could fight on. In truth, the empire was tottering. Supplies dwindled, soldiers starved on distant islands, and the once mighty navy was crippled. Still, in the streets of Tokyo, few could imagine that by dawn their city would be unrecognizable. What was about to unfold was not simply another raid, but the unveiling of a new strategy, one that harnessed America's limitless industrial power and combined it with brutal tactical innovation. The fire raid on Tokyo would dwarf anything seen in the war thus far. By the time the first bombs began to fall, an entire nation's destiny was being rewritten in the glow of the flames. The evening of March 9th, 1945, began like countless other missions from the Marianas. On Guam, Saipan and Tinian flight lines stretched into the horizon, packed with gleaming B-29 Superfortresses. Ground crews moved with urgency, loading each giant aircraft with clusters of incendiaries. Instead of the heavy armor-piercing bombs, crews once carried tonight's load was lighter in weight but infinitely more destructive. Each B-29 would unleash thousands of small firebombs designed not to shatter but to spread. By 5:30 p.m., the first planes roared down the runways, their four Wright R-3000, 350 engines thundering into the evening sky. One by one, 279 bombers lifted off, climbing into formation and pointing their noses toward the Japanese capital. The journey across the Pacific was long, nearly 1,500 miles, and every crewman understood the risks. At high altitude, oxygen masks and bulky suits had once shielded them from the cold, but tonight they flew low, stripped of many defensive guns to save weight for fuel and bombs. Without the armor of height, they would be easier targets, yet confidence filled the air. Intelligence reports suggested Japan's air defense was thin and poorly coordinated. General LeMay's gamble was about to be tested. As the long procession of bombers approached Honshu, the largest of Japan's islands, the sky was remarkably clear. Pathfinders armed with radar equipment flew ahead, their job to mark the target zone, the Shitamachi district of Tokyo. It was a sprawl of tightly packed wooden homes, narrow alleys, and countless workshops producing parts for the Japanese war machine. The city below slumbered, unaware that its night was about to erupt in fire. At precisely 12:08 a.m., the first Pathfinders released their incendiary clusters. From above, the bombs appeared almost delicate, drifting downward like glowing seeds. But when they struck, they burst apart, scattering napalm that clung to everything it touched. Within minutes, rooftops, blazed streets flickered with spreading flame, and the Shitamachi became a grid of fire markers visible even from miles away. The following waves of B-29 seconds now had their guide. Instead of aiming at pinpoint factories, they followed the fiery X marked across the city. Each formation flew in succession, dropping lines of incendiaries that overlapped and expanded the growing inferno. From the air, the effect was mesmerizing, fire blossoming in every direction, red and orange veins creeping outward until they merged into one seething mass. Inside the cockpits, American crews felt the strange violence of their own success. The heat rising from the city below struck their bombers with invisible fists, creating violent turbulence. Pilots fought the controls as gusts from the firestorm lifted their massive aircraft like toys. Gunners and radio operators reported the sensation of flying through an oven. Sweat soaked their uniforms despite the cool night air at 7,000 feet. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, but their shells burst blindly, groping for bombers hidden in the darkness. A few B-29 seconds shuddered under flak hits, but most pressed on undeterred. Interceptors scrambled from airfields around Tokyo, yet many arrived too late. Fuel shortages meant they could not remain in the sky long, and the sheer number of bombers overwhelmed their efforts. For the citizens of Tokyo, the nightmare unfolded with terrifying speed. Sirens wailed, but before many families could reach shelters, entire blocks were engulfed. Wooden houses ignited as if soaked in gasoline. Fire spread faster than footsteps. Escape routes vanished in seconds. The carefully plotted lines of incendiaries acted like walls, trapping tens of thousands inside flaming corridors. In the Marianas, planners had calculated that if enough bombs fell close together, individual fires would merge into a single monster, a firestorm. That prediction was now coming true. Winds whipped through the burning district at hurricane force, feeding oxygen to the inferno. The flames roared, sucking debris and even people into their vortex. Temperatures soared so high that the asphalt streets bubbled and melted beneath fleeing civilians. For the crews still circling above, the view was surreal. What had been a dark city minutes earlier now glowed like the surface of the Sunday. Some reported that the flames were so bright they could read their maps without a flashlight. Others were stunned by the sight of their massive bombers caught in the fiery updraft, tossed upward hundreds of feet as if in a storm. Veteran pilots, hardened by months of combat, admitted later that nothing in their lives prepared them for the sight of an entire city combusting beneath them. The first hour of bombing was decisive. The fire lines merged, emergency services collapsed, and communications faltered. Within only 14 minutes of the initial attack, Tokyo's firefighters had been overwhelmed. Engines broke down, hoses ran dry, and crews abandoned their posts as the inferno surged beyond human control. Back in the bombers, tension eased slightly. Crews who had feared interception realized the skies were largely theirs. LeMay's decision to fly low and at night had paid off. Losses were few compared to the devastation below, yet even as relief set in, awe and unease spread among the men. They had unleashed something that seemed less like warfare and more like elemental wrath, a force no one could restrain once begun. By the time the final formations reached the target zone, the Shitamachi was already a seething furnace. Dropping more bombs seemed almost redundant, yet the orders were clear: saturate the city until nothing remained unburned. So they released their loads, adding to the storm. And with each pass, Tokyo's night grew brighter, hotter, more apocalyptic. This was only the beginning. The raid was far from over, and what unfolded in the hours ahead would etch itself into history as the deadliest night of bombing the world had ever known. While the B-29 seconds traced fiery lines across the heavens, life in Tokyo dissolved into chaos. At ground level, the first warning sirens had howled shortly after midnight, but many families hesitated. Previous raids had been small, harassing pinpricks, that, while frightening, often passed without hitting their neighborhood. Some rushed toward shelters or canals, clutching bundles of clothes, food, and children. Others lingered, praying the bombs would fall elsewhere. Within minutes, hesitation became fatal. The first cascades of incendiaries clattered down like hailstones, exploding into fire that crawled along rooftops, walls, and streets. The Shitamachi district was built for disaster. Houses stood shoulder to shoulder, walls of wood and paper, stacked with futons, tatami mats, and bamboo furniture. Workshops cluttered alleys with crates of tools, machine parts, and paints. The moment napalm gel splashed against them, entire blocks erupted. In narrow lanes, fire leapt from one side to the other before people could escape. In wide boulevards, wind funneled the flames into tunnels of searing air. For the first time in history, a modern metropolis confronted a full-scale firestorm. Temperatures reached over 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. The inferno devoured oxygen so quickly that it created a violent vacuum, sucking in fresh air at gale force. Witnesses described the wind as a living creature, roaring, shrieking, and shoving bodies toward the flames. Mothers clutched children only to be wrenched from their arms by the storm. Survivors later recalled that even without flames nearby, the heat seared lungs and skin. People collapsed from suffocation in streets still untouched by fire. Those who fled to the Sumida River believed water would save them. Instead, the river became a trap. Bridges overflowed with thousands of desperate citizens jammed shoulder to shoulder. Bombs fell among them, scattering fire that clung to clothing and hair. Others jumped into the water, but soon the surface itself glowed with drifting napalm, turning the river into a boiling cauldron. People tried to dive beneath, but smoke and heat pressed them down. Entire families disappeared beneath black steaming currents. Firefighting crews attempted their duty, but by 12:30 a.m., barely 14 minutes after the first pathfinders struck, the system collapsed. Pumps failed, water lines ruptured, and hydrants went dry. Firemen abandoned engines, some simply laying down their hoses and walking into the smoke defeated. The flames raced faster than any human could move, overwhelming every attempt at control. In some neighborhoods, explosions from oil drums, gas cylinders, and stored ammunition amplified the terror. Above, B-29 crews watched in stunned disbelief. From their cockpits, they saw not scattered blazes, but a single coiling monster consuming miles of city. The glow stretched across the horizon, visible to bombers still hundreds of miles away on their approach. Crews spoke of towers of flame rising like mountains of turbulence, so violent it slammed men against bulkheads. Some superfortresses were hurled thousands of feet upward by the rising heat instruments, spinning wildly, wings groaning as though they might snap. A few aircraft staggered home, badly damaged, not by enemy fire, but by the very storm they had unleashed. Japanese fighters tried to intercept. Brave pilots clawed their way into the night, but fuel shortages limited their endurance. Radar and searchlights could not penetrate the smoke. Out of nearly 90 interceptors scrambled, few even found the American formations. Some fired blind bursts into the glowing haze, then turned away. In the end, Japan's vaunted air defense was powerless, for the people below the firestorm was merciless. Survivors described rivers of fire flowing through streets, flames racing faster than a man could run. Entire crowds collapsed in heaps, overcome by carbon monoxide. Bodies piled at intersections, charred together into unrecognizable forms. One diary found later spoke of hearing a sound like 1,000 kettles boiling as houses collapsed, roofs crashing into embers, and human voices were drowned by the roar. By dawn, the destruction was absolute. Nearly 16 square miles of eastern Tokyo had been erased. Some 267,000 buildings lay in ruins. Between 9,000,000 and 1,000,000 people were dead, more than in either atomic bombing that would follow months later. Over 1 million survivors wandered homeless through a landscape of ash. For the U.S., Army Air Force's losses were astonishingly light. Only 14 B-29 seconds failed to return. When the bombers landed back in the Marianas, crews staggered out, their uniforms reeking of smoke picked up from 3,000 feet above. Many were shaken into silence. They had followed orders, executed perfectly, and survived, but the scale of devastation seemed almost unreal. Tokyo was burning, one pilot said later. and we were watching it happen. The raid had achieved what General LeMay intended, proof that a new kind of warfare could reduce an enemy's capital to ashes in a single night. For Japan, it was a wound deeper than any battle on land or sea. For America, it was the prelude to an even harsher campaign yet to come. By midnight, the raid reached its dreadful zenith. The sky above Tokyo was no longer dark, but a vast dome of orange and red pulsing like a furnace. Crews in the later waves of B-29 seconds could see the glow from 150 miles away as they closed in. The city itself seemed to vanish beneath rolling clouds of smoke and flame, a storm that swallowed entire districts. This was no longer bombing as the world had known it. This was elemental destruction, a firestorm, consuming everything in its path. From 0030 to 0230 am, the inferno peaked. The fires, fed by hurricane-force winds, fused into a single monstrous vortex. Witnesses described it as if the earth itself had cracked open, spewing fire. Temperatures soared high enough to melt aluminum and buckle steel bridges. The storm drew in such a torrent of air that even massive B-29 seconds, 60 tons of metal, were tossed upward hundreds of feet in seconds. Pilots fought their controls, desperately, engines howling as if the planes themselves wanted to flee. For the American crews, shock mingled with awe. Navigator Robert Copeland recalled, "It was like looking into the Sunday. I never thought a city could burn so bright." Others said the turbulence slammed their men against bulkheads and ripped charts from their hands. Some planes returned to the Marianas, scorched, their aluminum skins blistered by the heat radiating from the ground thousands of feet below. These were not wounds from flak or fighters, but from the fire itself, a phenomenon so powerful it had become a weapon in its own right. On the ground, Tokyo's nightmare deepened. The Sumida River, once seen as a refuge, had turned into a grave. Entire families plunged into the black water only to surface into drifting pools of flaming napalm. Bridges buckled under the weight of crowds, then collapsed, hurling people into the blaze. Streets vanished beneath torrents of burning debris. The winds were so fierce that even those who survived initial blasts found themselves hurled back toward the flames, suffocated by smoke before they could escape. Civilians huddled in supposed air raid shelters soon realized they had dug their own tombs. Fires roared across open ground, consuming oxygen and turning basements into ovens. Survivors described people clawing at each other for air only to collapse in heaps. In some districts, entire shelters filled with hundreds of people were found later reduced to charred skeletons, locked forever in their final embraces. Even Japanese military units were paralyzed. Anti-aircraft crews abandoned their guns when ammunition cooked off in the heat. Fighter squadrons, already short on fuel, managed a few sorties but failed to inflict serious losses. Communication lines were down, fire brigades annihilated, civil defense shattered. In a city of millions, there was no command, no order, only survival, and even that was slipping away. Back in the skies, American crews executed their final runs. The target grid was already obliterated, yet the orders remained: cover the zone until every section burned. Bomb bay doors opened again, and still more incendiaries cascaded into the inferno, feeding a monster that needed no help. By the time the last formations made their drops, it was no longer Tokyo beneath them, but an unbroken ocean of fire. At 2:37 a.m., the last wave released its bombs. The city roared like a furnace door slamming shut. B-29 seconds banked away their engines, straining against the turbulent updraft. Exhausted crews watched as the horizon behind them glowed crimson, a line of fire stretching for miles. Many sat in silence, shaken by what they had unleashed. Some spoke of guilt, others of grim pride. All agreed they had never witnessed anything like it. When dawn broke, the scale became clear. Smoke drifted for miles out to sea, visible to returning bombers hours before they landed. Those who had flown the mission were greeted by ground crews, stunned at the stench of burned wood and flesh clinging to their uniforms. Reports soon filtered in 16 square miles, destroyed more than 267,000 buildings, gone nearly 1,000,000 dead. It was the deadliest air raid in history, dwarfing even the destruction of Dresden just weeks earlier. The night of March 9-10 was a turning point. It proved beyond question that LeMay's strategy worked. Precision had failed, but fire had succeeded horrifically so. In one night, the American Air Forces had accomplished what months of high-altitude raids could not. They had broken the back of a great city, and in doing so, they revealed the terrifying new face of modern war. For Tokyo's survivors, the dawn revealed a wasteland. The Shitamachi was gone, entire neighborhoods reduced to smoldering rubble. Corpses lay in heaps along riverbanks and intersections blackened beyond recognition. The air reeked of ash and death. Those who had lived through it wandered in shock, barefoot, burned, carrying nothing but the memory of what once was. And yet in American command posts back in the Marianas, the reaction was starkly different. Charts and maps marked the success. LeMay's gamble had paid off. If one city could be incinerated, then so could others. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, all were now in reach. The war had entered its final and most brutal phase, and Tokyo's fiery night was the opening act. As dawn broke on March 10th, 1945, Tokyo was unrecognizable. Smoke drifted in towering columns, blackening the sky and choking survivors as they stumbled through ruins. The eastern districts, once alive with markets, children and workshops, were gone. Where homes and alleys had stood the day before, only ashes remained. The smell of charred wood mingled with something more dreadful, the unmistakable stench of burned flesh. In one night, Japan's capital had been transformed into a graveyard without headstones. Survey teams soon measured the destruction. Nearly 16 square miles of Tokyo were obliterated. An estimated 267,000 buildings were reduced to rubble or ash. Over 1 million survivors were left homeless, forced to wander through a wasteland. Most devastating of all, between 9,000 and 1,000 people were killed, burned, suffocated, or drowned in the flaming Sumida River. The scale of death surpassed that of Dresden, Hamburg, or even the atomic bombings to come. This was the single deadliest night of aerial bombardment in human history. Yet for the United States Army Air Forces, the mission was recorded as a resounding success. Losses were remarkably low, only 14 B-29 seconds failed to return. General Curtis LeMay's radical gamble, stripping defensive guns, flying at low altitudes, and relying on incendiaries had proven devastatingly effective. At his headquarters in Guam, reports confirmed what the glowing horizon had already suggested: Tokyo had been broken. The consequences rippled outward. Within days, LeMay ordered repeat raids against other cities: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. The formula was the same: hundreds of bombers, thousands of tons of incendiaries, targets chosen, not for single factories, but for the sprawling cottage industries hidden in neighborhoods. Over the following months, more than 60 Japanese cities would be set aflame. By summer, observers remarked bitterly that Japan was running out of targets worth burning. Entire industrial regions had been erased, their populations scattered and homeless. For Japan's leaders, the shock was profound. The imperial government had assured its citizens that the homeland was impregnable, that the capital would never fall. Yet in one night, American bombers had incinerated a quarter of Tokyo. Factories, armories, and workshops were gone. Even more crippling was the psychological blow. Civilians realized that no shelter, no warning, no defense could save them. For many, morale collapsed. Diaries recovered after the war speak of stunned disbelief. "The gods have abandoned us," one survivor wrote. Strategically, the raid also exposed Japan's greatest weakness: dependence on dispersed, small-scale production in flammable wooden districts. What once protected industry from concentrated strikes now became a liability. American planners realized that fire, not explosives, was the key to victory. With its limitless industrial capacity, the United States could sustain such attacks indefinitely. Thousands of new incendiary bombs were produced weekly, and fleets of B-29 seconds rose nightly from the Marianas like clockwork. The war had shifted from a clash of fleets to a relentless war of annihilation from the skies. The ethical questions came later. At the time, few in the United States doubted the necessity of the raids. The Pacific War was brutal beyond measure. American soldiers still remembered Bataan, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima. To them, anything that hastened victory and saved the lives of U.S. troops was justified. General LeMay himself admitted bluntly, If we lose the war, we'll be tried as war criminals. But we won't lose the war. His words captured the ruthless logic of 1,945 overwhelming force applied without pause to bring Japan to its knees. For historians, the debate remains. Some argue that the March raid and those that followed were essential in forcing Japan towards surrender. Others condemn the indiscriminate nature of firebombing, calling it a war crime in all but name. Yet in the context of the time, American commanders saw no alternative. Japan's military government showed no signs of yielding. Every week the war continued meant more Allied soldiers dead in Okinawa, more merchant ships sunk in the Pacific, more civilians starved across Asia. The firebombing campaign promised to shorten that agony even at a horrific cost. The legacy of Operation Meetinghouse is stark. It stands as both a testament to America's industrial might and a haunting reminder of war's capacity for destruction. In one night, the United States demonstrated not only that it could strike the Japanese homeland at will, but that it could annihilate its urban centers entirely. Alongside the submarine blockade strangling Japan's supply lines and the looming threat of atomic weapons, the fire raids accelerated Japan's collapse. By August 1945, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki incinerated by nuclear blasts, the empire finally surrendered. But for Tokyo's survivors, victory and defeat meant little compared to memory. Children wandered streets searching for parents who would never return. Families carried the ashes of loved ones in small urns, clinging to fragments of lives erased in hours. Even decades later, survivors remembered the howling winds, the unbearable heat, and the sight of the city they loved consumed by fire. Operation Meetinghouse was not simply a military action. It was a turning point in human history, when the sheer scale of destruction forced the world to confront what industrial war could mean for civilians. It foreshadowed the terrifying power of modern warfare, power that would soon be magnified by atomic fire. And it left a question that echoes still. Was it necessary, or was it simply inevitable in a war without limits? For America, the answer in 1945 was clear. The raid proved that the arsenal of democracy could reduce an empire to ashes. For Japan, it marked the beginning of the end, and for the world it remains a night when war revealed its darkest face, lit by the flames of a burning capital.